Hello, and welcome to Medieval Lulls, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Irina Dumitrescu.
And I'm Mary Wellesley.
And we are both writers, literary historians, and contributors to the paper. In this series, we are asking, was the Middle Ages funny? We're taking a tour through texts both familiar and unfamiliar, in English, Latin, and other European vernacular languages, and hunting for laughter and jest in the textual remains of the past. In this penultimate episode, we are taking some dubious life advice from a collection of parables written by a 14th century Spanish prince. What to do if your wife is a shrew, the best way to rob a grave, and what men really want. So sit back, relax, and let us treat you to some medieval self-help, courtesy of Juan Manuel, a thrice-married duke who spent his teens fighting Muslim forces in southern Spain. So, Maria, the text we're talking about is the Tales of Count Lucanor. Can you tell us a little bit about it? What time are we in? What place?
So this is a text written between 1328 and 1335 by Juan Manuel, who is the Prince of Villena. It's one of the earliest works of prose in Castilian Spanish and also considered, a great work of medieval Spanish prose. He was himself a very important writer of the Spanish Middle Ages. We know from some of his texts that he's the author of 12 books, but unfortunately 5 of them are lost. And this particular one is the most famous. It's divided into 5 parts, and it's the first part today that we're going to be looking at. It survives in 7 manuscripts. But they're in kind of varying states of completeness, and we can talk about that a bit later. It's first printed in Seville in 1575, and then printed again in the 17th century in Madrid, and then it sort of disappears from view. The part that we are talking about is the series of short stories that appear in the beginning part of this 5-part work. So parts 2 to 4 are proverbs, and part 5 is a treatise on how to save your soul. But this bit are these kind of amazing short stories, and they're drawn from lots of different sources. Some of them are based on Aesop, on classical they on Arabic folk tales, and they are sort of exemplar, to use the Latin term. The structure of them is that we have this character, Count Lucanor, and he, the Count Lucanor, and he is talking to his advisor, Patronio, and he will often ask Patronio about some particular issue that he has, and then Patronio will, often in a slightly kind of ham-fisted way, provide some sort of story that he feels illustrates the point that he's trying to make.
And I think this is really one of the very typical medieval uses of literature, right? That I think these days, now we tend to think of literature as more of an entertainment or an aesthetic object, or maybe philosophical. But stories are supposed to teach you how to live in the Middle Ages. The one thing about them is that they don't always teach you in a really clear way, or, you have to do some interpreting. It's really the process of interpreting stories that helps you learn. But there is a sense, I mentioned self-help in the introduction, but there is a sense that literature is meant to be a guide to life. That doesn't mean taking it seriously 100% of the time, but it means that it has a rhetorical power in that sense. And it's interesting to look at the prologue, which I'll read a little bit from a 19th century translation, which is the only one we found in English, of El Conde Lucanor, which is by James York and published in 1899. And it's not always a very good translation. We're going to be very forthright about this, but it's the only one. And there's a prologue in which the writer talks about how, although all men possess will, mind, and feelings alike, little as they resemble each other in features, still less do they in these other qualities. Each acquires a greater fitness and aptitude, while self-interest is the stimulant. So basically, the idea is people are all different. Everybody has their own interests. Everyone has their own concerns. If you want to convey your knowledge to another, he writes, endeavor to convince him that it is for his own interest. So you have to teach people in a way or convince people in a way that appeals to what they think is good for them. And later in the preface, Juan Manuel compares stories to a medicine, right? The way that physicians might mix medicines with sugar, honey, or something else to make them more agreeable. So this is another very typical trope, the idea of being taught in a way that's pleasant, right? The medicine that's mixed with sweet to make it more palatable. So I think that's if you like, the theoretical place where we are, where literature is a way of making lessons delicious to take in, and in a way, relevant, because every person interprets a story in a way that's relevant to them. So they they find their own self-interest in a story.
Yeah, I think that prologue is so interesting. And one of the things that I find fascinating was that first bit that you referred to, where he talks about how there are so many different types of people, and everyone interprets things differently. And it's sort of intriguing in a way because it's very sort of, in some ways, accepting of different viewpoints. And to some degree, we might sort of think about the wider cultural context in which this text is written. This is a time in which there is no kind of Spain as we would understand it today. The Iberian Peninsula is a series of kingdoms, and Juan Manuel is the ruler of Murcia, which is sort of if you imagine the Iberian Peninsula as a bit of a square and divided into quadrants, it's the bottom right-hand quadrant. And right on the very, very bottom, there's this long sort of sausage-shaped bit right at the bottom, which is the Andalusia, but really the Kingdom of Granada, which remains under Muslim control until 1492. And so in this period, when the text is being written between 1328 and 1335, this is a period in which Christians and Muslims, and there are large Jewish communities as well, particularly in the south of Spain, are all living certainly not harmoniously, but definitely living side by side at times in very kind of multicultural communities. And it's an interesting thing in this text that there are often places in which Muslims are being kind of othered, but equally the text is filled with tropes and figures from Arabic folklore. And so it's a really interesting prologue to set up right at the beginning, this kind of acceptance of other people's viewpoints. And in a sense, that's kind of the tension also in the way that each of these stories is introduced, because very often the story doesn't quite fit the problem that's being addressed. And so sort of even within that, there's a sort of understanding that no one's going to come to the same conclusion about this, and you might interpret this story differently. And obviously in this series, we've talked about quite a few other texts that do quite similar things, these kind of big story collections that have these kind of interesting frame narratives that invite us to consider and kind of reconsider the interpretation of a story.
And maybe we should talk a little bit about what each story looks like or how it's framed, right? In Boccaccio's Decameron, we had this frame narrative of escape, of escape and entertainment, right? Whiling away the time, where each of the characters sort of had to tell a story a day, and it was very much structured that way as part of the way that they kept their minds busy while they were writing out the plague. Here we have something different. We have the Conde Lucanor, the Count Lucanor, describing a problem, right? And it's often a kind of political problem or personal problem or somewhere in between. And then his advisor, Patronio, tells him this story. And as you said, it's sometimes a little bit aslant. Sometimes it very clearly fits the problem, and sometimes it doesn't. And then there's this little moral at the end. Sometimes he then makes his advice quite clear. He says, "I wouldn't do this, and this is why." But the interesting tension in that is that the stories are not presented as mere entertainment, or as passing the time, or even as a contest the way they are in the Canterbury Tales, right, where someone is supposed to win the contest. Here, the tension is political. It's a power imbalance. How does somebody who has less power advise someone who has more power? And this is a concern throughout the Middle Ages. They're obsessed with this issue, which I think is not, it's not its importance is not limited to the Middle Ages. Let's put it that way. How do you speak to power? How do you convey a message to someone who rules over you in a way that they will be able to understand it, adapt it, accept your wisdom in that moment? There are lots of stories about rulers not following advice, or being saved by the advice of their wise men and so on. So this is, I think that's what gives it a special flavor, that it's somewhere between moral instruction and political instruction as well. But maybe we should just get into some of the stories and take a look at how they work.
So the Spanish edition that we're using is an edition by José Manuel Blecua. And the story that we're going to talk about here is story number 8 in that, the Ejemplo 8. And in the York translation, that is chapter 29. So the story opens with Conde Lucanor saying to Petronio that he owes some money and he really needs to pay his creditors and he doesn't really know what to do. And Petronio says, well, don't worry, I can tell you a story which will tell you about what happens when you're suffering from this malady. And he says, once there was a man who was in great pain from a disease, and there was no other remedy than for a doctor to cut him open and take out his liver and wash it in some certain medicated waters. And then, and anyway, so as he is lying on the operating table, another man who is in the room while the liver has been removed says, please, may I have a piece of the liver for my cat? And so Petronio says, and this is a perfect illustration of how, you should never give something up in a way that will do terrible injury to yourself. And you should never give things up to people who can afford to go without it for a while. Which is a strange way to see debt, I think.
I love this story beyond all words, and it just strikes me that it's a funny as a moral, right? As a moral tale or as a teaching tale, it's not very good because it's such a ridiculous scene, right? It's such an absolutely ridiculous imagination. First of all, why is there a man standing there in the room where the operation is taking place? Why does he want a piece of liver for the cat?
But where's the cat?
Where's the cat?
Is the cat in the room?
I remember reading this when I was reading this, sort of working my way through the medieval Spanish and thinking, did I just read what I read? That cannot be the case, but it is su gato, it is the cat. But I think what it captures is not so much advice about how to deal with creditors, but it captures an element of human nature, which is very specific and very honest, which is that when people see you in a really difficult situation, but think they could still get something out of you, they will try. Not everybody, maybe most of the people are involved in the operation to help you, but there'll always be somebody out there who will see that you're down and you're at your weakest and think, how can I get a little piece of this? How can I get some of this? And
how can my cat get a little piece of
my
this?
cat, yeah.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Medieval Lols, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. You can listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series by signing up to our close reading subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.